Um, Jumping right in today, we are going to cover a couple different topics. So first is we're going to talk about when to add different capabilities to your stack. What are some of those core capabilities? Overview of a growth stage stack. We'll talk about enrichment, lead scoring, and lead routing. And our amazing guest, Kiki Burden, who I'll introduce in a second, is going to weave in some storytelling from her career. And what you'll find in today's discussion is that's going to be a lot more conversational. And I would kind of just encourage people to bring up questions along the way. We're moving into the part of the course where now things get messy. You know, we've talked about some of the theoretical frameworks for how your company should grow over time and what those stages and stacks look like. There's been a request to like get more technical. And like when I see that request, I'm like, well, stuff that's technical often is nuanced based on the tools and the situation. So one of my goals for this conversation today is hopefully deliver some of that value to you by having specific examples. With that, I would love to just introduce Kiki. I don't know if you want to introduce yourself, Kiki.
Sure. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Austin. Super excited to be here. So I currently lead growth at Upside, which is a two-sided marketplace, and I lead growth on our B2B side of the business. But I actually started my career in MarTech and data platforms and DMPs when that was a thing, if you're as old as I am, and then made my way over to the marketing side, having built stuff for marketers for most of my career. Really wanted to sort of be a practitioner. So led marketing at Plaid and Credit Karma, and then have been at Upside for the last 8 months or so. What else? I also am Austin's neighbor. I recently moved back to DC, which has been really fun to get to jam out on all things RevTech in person. But yeah, that's me in a nutshell.
And I hardly ever get to say that. I feel like nobody lives in DC.
True.
Wonderful. So real quick, I'm gonna go through a couple of pre-slides, and then we're gonna jump into some deeper topic. So the course outlines a really detailed workflow of how to decide whether to add certain capabilities to the stack. You guys have probably seen this in a little bit of the reading. And so let's walk through this really quickly. So here are just like a few simple ideas from that larger text to emphasize. The first is like so obvious, but I cannot stress it enough. It's know what problem you're trying to solve and make sure that the severity of the problem you're solving is aligned to the size and stage of your company. Can't stress this enough because, you know, one thing you'll find as you move from a small organization to a large organization is that you're never going to run out of work. You know, there's always going to be more problems to solve. There's always going to be fires that are burning. The question is, what fires do you let burn, and what fires do you, throw the lid on the dumpster in and try to get an extinguisher for? And just to be really specific about it, an example of a problem that I don't solve that often. You know, Chris and I actually can attest to this just now. It's like, hey, do we actually have to get all of our data from Post-Hog and Customer IO and our warehouse and Clarify to all be one-to-one? And sure, it'd be really nice. Shai, I think you actually brought up this example in the course on Maven. It's like, hey, even at a big stage company, we have people who want their sources of truth to be aligned across tools. And the question is like, is that a worthy problem philosophically to solve? Sure. But is it the problem that is going to help your company be better? And if so, why? So start with the problems whenever you think about capabilities and challenges to undertake. The second is make sure you can't solve the problem with an existing tool. It's like kind of instinct, especially for nerds like us, to reach for a tool to solve a problem. This is especially the case at a big organization where there's not an understanding across the org about what tools exist to solve problems. There may be one person in the entire organization of 200 people who knows exactly how to solve this problem in a domain with an existing tool set. This is, again, this ladders into why I talk a lot about documentation and collaborating across teams, is because if you don't have those systems in place to share knowledge, then people are going to do what's easiest. They're going to reach for the tool that they know solves the problem based on past experience. So an example of this at Ramp was we had a lot of people creating audiences, and they would create audiences in actually 5 or 6 different tools. They would create them in Clearbit, which is like the most bizarre place to create audiences. They would create them in HubSpot. They would create them in Salesforce. They would ask for them in Looker. And they could also create them with personas in Segment. And so, it's not necessarily a problem. Hey, I don't care if people are creating audiences in different tools. The real problem was that these audiences were not one-to-one. They were using different data, and when they sent them out to downstream destinations, they got crazy results because all these audiences were being manifested out of different underlying data sets. So 2 different problems now. Hey, how do I make it easy for the marketing team to self-serve audience creation? And then 2, how do I make it so that they're comparing apples to apples? Well, that's a great reason to consolidate or refine and kind of close off the ways that people can solve a problem with existing tools. So that's a really good use case you might come through. And this comes up all the time, especially as a company is growing, where you're considering adding new capability and you got to look internally first. Next one is this is pretty obvious actually, only build internally when there's a real reason to. I've seen both sides of this coin. I've worked for organizations that reach to buy much sooner than they should. And I worked at Ramp where our instinct was to build probably way more than we should have. And so I think only build in cases where it's really gonna provide you a competitive advantage, and you should think about what that looks like strategically and have the conversation with the engineering team. Secondly, there's this great adage from Tony Ralph, who I worked with at Walmart, where he really liked to reframe this as build and buy. And Walmart was in a particularly a good position to build and buy because they would often end up building on top of technologies and then actually acquiring the company, which is that's only a pro move you can have if you're Walmart. But I especially think for some of our later stage companies, Series C, Series D, IPO-based companies, that is a real consideration you might be having when you try a piece of software tool. You may be having the conversation with yourself, if this is a Series Seed, $5 million bootstrap company, and we really want to use it, is there a world where we could actually acquire the team and the technology afterwards on buying on top? And that's not necessarily something that I think a lot of operators think about, but it certainly should be at the later stages of company growth. And at the earlier stages of company growth, it's much more of verbatim build and buy. Build on top of great tools, buy things that are necessary. Key, I want to stop for a second because you might have been in some of these positions where you could buy, and I'd love to just hear from you on if you have a perspective to share about building versus buying, and what particularly you would classify as being competitive enough to build versus not.
Yeah, I just dropped a note in the chat. The mantra I always go back to is buy the bones and build the connective tissue. And the connective tissue can be the speed, the sharing of data, the scoring of data. But when it comes to building your own CRM platform or building your own ESP, there are companies out there with hundreds or thousands of employees who can build this enterprise architecture and leverage that expertise, but then build what is really unique to your business. At Credit Karma, we actually decided to build our own email service platform, our own ESP. It happened to be named Kiki after Kiki's Delivery Service, the Japanese, which caused a lot of pain and frustration. It was named before I started. And it was the biggest pain in the ass ever. And it required 30 engineers to keep it alive. And was that the best deployment of capital? I would argue no. And so I just, again, always sort of anchor to buy the bones, build the connective tissue that makes those tools work incredibly well within your own environment. And never build your own ESP.
Yeah, never built. Even Walmart tried. They built an ESP back in the early 2000s, and then they ended up switching to Braze when I was with them. I mean, it's just proof in the pudding. If you're Walmart and you can't do it, you probably shouldn't be doing it. It's such a commoditized tool too. There's no reason to go build
Are
something like that.
so huge and complex. So the chances of them getting everything right when you don't run it as your whole company, yeah. That
Yeah, usually a good signal for that is like if there's an IPO based company that's doing something, you probably shouldn't build it. Um, okay, last tip before we move on. As your tool set grows, you're certainly going to increase the risk of some of the factors we talked about in the Frick framework. So like inconsistencies, duplicative data, and there can be kind of redundancy that's bad. You can get into issues with compatibility. And this is where I feel like two things kind of I always come back to. One is I cannot stress enough governance and documentation. Like this, it's so basic, but it's one of the things that I see lacking across almost every organization that I consult and work for, is that people don't invest consistently in how to govern your tools. And governance is a human process. Like there's no AI bot yet that can do all of governance. Governance is education, governance is tools, governance is writing down how you operate. And I would argue, though, it's never been easier to do this stuff because when I think about what governance means to me, it's like, okay, let me go through every tool and document who has access on what tool, what the tool is used for, who's the owner, who's the account manager, how much we're paying, get a state of the land of what the stack is, build the stack diagram, and then write a series of SOPs about how all these things work and how we kind of work with these tools in different capacities. And that's usually the first thing I do in any consulting gig or coming in as an operator. That's what I look for. It's never been easier to do that now with GPT and Claude. Like you can literally record conversations with people in the organization and throw it all into GPT and Claude and be like, this is the outcome I'm looking for. I want a table with these things. I want a diagram. If you can't make the diagram, there's actually really cool. I don't know if you guys heard of, what is it? It's not Scribble. I'm totally blank on the name of it. I use this tool to basically draw little mini maps and they have Markdown. So if you give it the Markdown documentation, you can be like, hey, draw me a diagram in Markdown. And then when you load it into the tool, it will draw the whole diagram for you. And then at the end, you can be like, okay, now write me an SOP on how to manage these tools and maybe give me some suggestions of things I should change, right? Most common things you're going to be changing are, what are we using tools for? Who gets access to them? What tools are duplicative? What's the timeline for them? So that's one piece, is like there's really no excuse anymore not to do this work because it's never been easier. The second thing is you should always aim for loose coupling. So we talked about tight coupling and loose coupling in the framework that we discussed a couple weeks back. And loose coupling here is going to mean, hey, wherever possible, don't create duplicative syncs. So an example of really tight coupling is HubSpot and Salesforce, where both tools are tightly coupled together. They're both talking to one another, and they have a bunch of spokes, like in the hub and spoke model. They have a bunch of spokes that are kind of sending data into them, and then they're cross-syncing that data. That creates really tight coupling. So as much as possible, you should be moving data from point A to point B in a downstream motion. That's the whole reason why the stack diagrams we've created literally represent a funnel, is to reinforce the idea that you're following the source of gravity. Before we talk about what you should have in your stack, I want to just answer some of these questions real quick here. So we got our first question is, how do you strike the balance between tool customization and maintaining a standard set up for scalability? From Kaylee. Do you have any thoughts on this, Kiki, or you want me to answer?
Why don't you go ahead and start and then I'll chime in.
Okay. Kaylee, I'd love to hear from you and what you mean around customization and what is like a standardized set? Like what do you mean by those words?
So, like basically like talking about governance and investing in making sure that you have everything documented. Like that but like also as your company grows and changes, your tech stack has to evolve, right? So
Mm-hmm.
making sure that you kind of have that flexibility built into your tech stack. So you have it customized for whatever specific needs your company needs to fit. But like that can also lead to like technical debt, right? So I guess like how do you find that balance of like not over indexing and like making things too customized or too specific with like limiting flexibility by like having a standard of what's needed? Does that make sense?
I think so. I think you're getting at what you're saying. Look, I would say let's talk about a company that's going through its life cycle, right? It starts as a nice, cute little Series C company, and they have no go-to-market motion, and then they find out they know how to make money. And at that moment in time, they buy a CRM, they buy a outbounding tool, maybe they install CDP. And I'd say in the beginning, and probably even pre-product market fit and post-market fit, there's really no rules. People are connecting shit however they can connect them, because the name of the game is staying alive. Nobody gives a shit about how great your stack is when you don't make any money to stay alive. Now, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't care about these things. Doesn't mean you shouldn't strive to put governance in place. As a great example, like I'm in the who gives a shit mode at Clarify right now. Me and Chris are doing everything we can to generate leads. Like we are going to do everything possible to make that happen. And if that means we have to diverge from our standard way of doing things, we're going to do it, because making money is more important than anything else in the business right now. But as an example, we just had this conversation today, literally right before this. We have a flow inside Clarify that kicks off a lemless campaign. So it's like you would think, hey, people get qualified in a list, and then you trigger a campaign somewhere else. And there's two ways of doing it. We can do it actually in Clarify with workflows, or we can do it in Zapier with Zaps. What is the right way to do it? Like, in my opinion, it doesn't actually matter which way we do it, as long as we're not crossing those two at the same time. That's where you get into race conditions. It's like, hey, if we updated a field in Clarify that we then depend on in Zapier, we're fucked. So those are the types of decisions I think you have to make early on, is like, it doesn't actually matter where you do things and how you connect them, as long as you're thinking thoughtfully about what are the impacts of this choice on the rest of my stack, and can I start to develop some rules around how I do things. For us, the way that works out is like we have a weekly governance meeting with me, our head of sales, Chris. It's going to be more engineers as they join. We have a growth engineer joining. And that's the first step, is just say, hey, do we have eyes on what we're doing? And we also have an SOP doc in Notion where we're like, okay, every time we make a change, we try to document it just so like there's some shared knowledge around what's happening. So you don't walk into workflows and all of a sudden you're like, whoa, shit, there's like 10 workflows and I don't know how any of these things are running. Now that's kind of pre-product market fit. And I'd imagine as you're going to the growth side of the company, that customization, that that standardization becomes a lot more, okay, let's actually be really specific now about where we're doing things and what the right way of doing things are. And I would say like it's a slider scale. Growth means a lot of different things for different companies. If you're a 50-person company compared to a 200-person company, it's a big difference. But the objective is, as you approach scale, as you get to 200, 500, a million, 10 million, $100 million in revenue, the means by which you processitize stuff and you put things in boxes and close off avenues for making decisions has to occur. Because otherwise, like, there's just too many people having too much impact on a stack that's too loose. And so as an example at Ramp, joined when there was 200 people, left when there was close to 800. One of the first observations I had is that there was no framework for how we add tools to the stack. Like there's literally like no process. So anybody could go and just add a tool to HubSpot or to Segment or to Salesforce. So one of the first things we did is say like, okay, let's like not even think about how to add tools. Let's just put a process in place. So we eliminated over 100 different admins. So there are 100 admins in these tools, just totally knocked out admins. And we said, great, we're going to create a channel called Go-to-Market Stack Help. And if you want to add a tool, you can go here and you can ask for help. And we're going to start processing these through a typical vendor process. That channel was staffed with me, with our head of sales ops, with Justin Tung, who you guys met earlier in the week. And we started having conversations with different leaders across the org when they had needs. And we're like, oh, actually, what you're trying to do, we can already do today. We have 5 tools for it. So let's just pick a tool and do it. So that's an example of where, hopefully you're building that infrastructure as you see it occurring in the company, and you don't find yourself in a place where all of a sudden you have to do all this retroactive work. Ramp was a special case because it just grew so quickly. The analogy that you'll find in your own company, though, is that you may enter this situation where like this work hasn't been done and you have to scramble to do a lot of that work. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's really helpful. Thank you. I was in a similar position with Packet where we just had so many admins and so many people were adding tools and it was a little unwieldy. So I was trying to figure out how that balance would work, but that's really helpful. Thank you.
Totally. I'm a tool god. It's like get admins out of there, you know? Go ahead, Kiki.
I would just add that, like, to me, the most critical element is getting your data structure correct. And then the tools, to some degree, almost become a little plug and play, but like, are you collecting the right elements in your CRM? Do you have the right hierarchy? Are you collecting the appropriate, elements from your website? Are you collecting the appropriate in product signals? And as you mature, that can change, but it's the lack of structure and schema that then cascades all of these issues downstream. And so, yes, documentation is obviously very important, and I don't want to dismiss it, but just having people internally who really understand that data flow is so critical, and really invest in those folks.
Yeah, and this actually dovetails really nicely into a second question that that Anne wrote, which is like, how would you recommend when to have documentation and how do you make sure it doesn't get stale? And I would argue like the moment in time to start documentation is the second you have more than one person doing it. So like, again, even at Clarify, we have our own SOP internally for how we manage tools. Now, I know it's not up to date, but the hope and expectation is that we start to build the habit of documenting stuff. We already have like a channel for helping people with the go-to-market stack. And as the company grows, that will be something we implement is we'll say, hey, look, we're 8 people, 9 people. We can't actually have everybody just going in and making any change they want. There should be a central place where we think about making these decisions together. And so if we make them, there's tons of visibility across the org. I would also say, especially for the big orgs, I saw you nodding your head, Shai, earlier, this is such an uphill battle because there's so many people to serve. There are so many surface areas where knowledge can be gathered. And I actually think like there's some very basic things you can do to make it easy. It's like have a centralized help channel. We use Linear for our ticketing system. If you use Asana or Jira, it's the same thing. You can set up a Slack channel to serve as like a service counter where people will only ask questions and will create tickets out of the questions they ask. So my strong recommendation is like if you have a sales org or a marketing org that's asking questions about tools, create a service center where anytime, like that is the place that you go on a road tour and you talk to every single leader in the org, whether it's the head of growth, the head of marketing, the head of sales, your sales leaders, go on a road show saying, hey, when you have questions, this is the place to go to get answers. Don't go in Jira, don't go to a random person, don't talk to your friend, don't go in a DM, go to the channel and ask the question. And then in the Slack channel or the Teams channel, you litter it with bookmarks with the key resources that people need that are updated and verified. So you internally may have 100 different diagrams and other things that you're working on. Like what is the key thing that people need to know and have access to and that they can look at? Now, a last thing I would say is this question comes up of like, well, how do I keep it up to date? If you create one knowledge center, like a Notion doc or a homepage that kind of acts as the central place for people to come, it's actually not too hard to work with an engineer to update that documentation. There's some really cool tools out here we can talk about later that like basically will update Notion or Google Drive for you based on knowledge internally. That's something that Chris and I are talking a lot about because it's the same problem that you have externally with your customers. Customers are asking questions in different surface areas like Slack. How do you get that knowledge and then update it into your help docs? How do you update that knowledge in your support docs? I would argue this is one of those examples of a place where I would engage with IT and engineering to ask the question, hey, how do I actually update things automatically from my Slack service channel? It could be as simple as like, can I get a weekly download of all the conversations, run it through GPT, put that into something inside of Notion so people can search through it easier. There's lots of things you can do off the shelf. They don't have to be totally automated.
And I would have every new hire audit your documentation because they're great people to say, this doesn't make sense. This is out of date, whatever. And they can, it's just really helpful to make sure it doesn't get stale.
Yep. Okay, we are at the halfway mark. I'm gonna flip over here and hand it up to Kiki, who's gonna talk a little bit about, or wait, no, I think I'm a little bit ahead. Let me go through these slides real quick, Kiki. You're supposed to take over on slide 16. I apologize.
Go for it.
We'll get through this real quick. We'll hand it over to Kiki for a 10-minute talk. So we talked a little bit about, you know, what are some considerations I should have in adding new capabilities. Then there's the very obvious of like what I should have in my stack. I would largely say that everybody in this room knows the tools they should have in their stack. So this is going to be very brief. If you guys have questions, though, we can spend some time there. First, the CDP. Everyone knows what a CDP is. CDP is a customer data platform. It collects events and users. It's often connected to your CRM. Examples would be tools like Segment, previously mParticle. There's Snowplow. There's PostHog. There's RudderStack. There's a lot of different CDPs out there. CDPs in particular, though, I think are well known in the B2C space for collecting website data and mobile data. They have kind of become central to a B2B2C platform and a B2B platform now. If you have a marketing website or an application that people are buying, you would track those analytics events, you would unify them inside a CDP. This connection layer between CDP and CRM, I think, deserves like a 5-hour discussion. So I'm going to ignore that for now. But I'm sure if there's questions around, hey, how do I elegantly connect my CDP and CRM, we can talk about it. What does the CDP do? For people who don't know, it basically allows you to collect anonymous identities of users and known identities of users. In a traditional stack, like we had at Ramp, we would be identifying people on the main marketing site with anonymous IDs. When they go through what we called our qualification flow, which we'll talk about a little bit later, we would gather information like how many employees are your organization, what's your annual spend, what size and stage are you? Everybody qualifies people in the B2B landscape. At that last step of qualification, we have your email and we have those answers, and so we'll qualify you. And that qualification then leads to lead routing. Now, everything up until that time, all that data is being tracked inside the CDP. You're tracking anonymous page visits, you're tracking known page visits when they give you your email, you're tracking qualification step 1, qualification step 2. If they bounce from qual and they go to different parts of your marketing website, that's all inside a CDP. Everything on your marketing website is hopefully captured by a CDP. Now, the real question becomes like, when does this become a contact in a CRM? And for us, it became a contact the moment in time that you entered your email and you became qualified. Because at that point, now marketing has the ability to re-engage you and follow up. And I'll talk very specifically what we did at Ramp, and then Kiki, you can give your own examples. But this is an example where we actually didn't use an out-of-box integration. We built our own qual page, our own qual flow that had a bunch of enrichment layered in. And at the moment in time where people enter their email address, we would make a direct API call to HubSpot. Now, the reason we did this is because the integration between Segment and HubSpot was not that reliable. And we also wanted to do a bunch of other stuff that we couldn't rely on Segment to do. So, for example, we wanted to store in an internal database. We wanted to run an enrichment process in the background. We had a scoring algorithm we were running in the background. So for those reasons, the flow was something like this. You come in, get qualified, we track you with a CDP identify call. We fire off a HubSpot event. At the same time, we're running a process on a Python server that's effectively firing off a hook to our database. It's kicking off a process to enrich them, kicking off a process to score them. At that moment in time, though, now you have like a record with ID 123, both in your CDP and in HubSpot. And all those two sources of data are piping into a warehouse where they're being joined on the same key. This is a little bit complicated. Is it the best way to do it? Probably not. It was the way that was designed by our growth engineering team. And at some point in time, what made it impossible to change is that CRM identity, which was in HubSpot, became one-to-one matched with Salesforce because we used the sync connector between Salesforce and HubSpot. So now it made it really freaking hard for us to go change HubSpot because Salesforce was relying on the same ID. The other reason we did it this way, which is more of a complicated marketing use case, is that we actually wanted to pass identity data and marketing attributes from the top of the funnel all the way through to the CRM and then into the warehouse and have them in every single system. So we would track marketing identity, have it in the CDP, these like UTM parameters. Those would flow into HubSpot as attributes on the profile. Those would flow into Salesforce as attributes on the contact. And all that would be syndicated into the warehouse. There was a specific reason why we had to do it that way, which I won't go into, but that's the use case there. as I said, all this data ends up in the warehouse. This is probably like the only approach that I'd recommend if you have something complicated and nasty, because ultimately you can join any data set by different IDs inside the warehouse with engineering resources. If you're coming from a background where like, hey, I don't have those engineering resources, we don't have a warehouse where I can store data, then you would probably be doing this part a little differently. You might be relying on the integrated connectors right outside of the CDP because you don't have the ability to join data later inside the house. Everybody probably knows what a warehouse is, so I'll skip this. And then a bunch of people probably heard about this idea of like the composable CDP. I just want to stress actually that composability in my mind actually applies to like every single MarTech and RevTech tool out there now. There used to be a world, I think, Kiki, that you and I lived in 8 years ago where things were not composable and you'd buy tool sets to cover many use cases in one. I mean, the classic example is obviously the CDP where you collect data, you federate audiences, you federate data, you have an SDK that kind of lives in all your tools to collect it. But if you think about it now, that can be broken up into many different disparate sets. You have the ability to federate audiences and collect audiences. You can collect data different tools. And so there's this question now around, have we moved out of an aggregated tool landscape into a collection of capabilities amongst many tools? I think in some ways, yes. What you're also seeing at the exact same time is like tools now just do more. And there's lots of overlapping possible redundancies. This is the reason why that framework that we talked about is so useful, is because lots of tools do things now. You can collect data with Braze and AppsFlyer and Amplitude. You can actually build charting in all those tools. You can create audiences in all those tools. You can federate data in all those tools. So all tools are in some ways aggregates. And so the question then becomes like, how do I pick the different tools to do the bespoke job I'm thinking of? In a composable landscape, you pick tools for very bespoke purposes, and you use the warehouse as a way to construct them as your central source of truth. That is it for my slides. I'm going to hand it over to Kiki. Got about 15 minutes for you to talk through, well, how do we actually put this into practice? How do we get more leads? And we can also try to address some of the questions that have come up along the way.
Awesome. So I would actually change this slide to how do I get more quality leads? Because thanks, look at this, real-time updates. At the end of the day, yes, first off, I don't think your marketing team should ever be gold on MQLs. Fundamentally, it should be gold on revenue to the business, right? And so more leads with lower quality does not get you there. It's really higher quality leads. And that goes back to, really, are you reaching out to the right universe? Do you have enough data and segmentation for that universe? Can you pull the right people through the funnel, which goes, deep into everything that Austin's been talking about and a lot of the tech capabilities. So if you go to the next slide, please, at the most fundamental level, there are leads that come inbound and leads that go outbound. Inbound leads could be people filling out a contact sales form on your website. They could be people stopping by your booth at a trade show. Outbound could be your SDR, reaching out to key contacts. It could be your SDR or your AE dropping off bagels if they're going old school. But like either people are coming to you or you are going to them. But then the real reality here is that the average number of touch points before a contact becomes a lead in any B2B business is 7. And so it's often a combination of both, different channels, inbound and outbound, and goes back to this root of why it is so important to make sure that your systems are talking to each other, you've got the right data, but that also internally your teams are talking to one another. So you've got your marketing team, you've got your sales team, you've got your customer sports team. I actually, both at Plaid and here, I lead both marketing and SDRs because it is so important that we have our outbound sales reps so closely tied into our SDRs. And it goes back to sort of exactly this principle and the different touch points across all of these different inbound and outbound sources.
Hey, Kiki, before we go to the next slide. So this I think is happening everywhere in marketing sales right now, which is like, it's easier than ever to do more with less. And especially at earlier stage companies, the line between a sales operator and a marketing operator is kind of getting blurred. great example. And Chris, I'm picking on you this whole episode. Thank you for being tolerant. Chris is running our outbound campaigns, but he's a marketer. Like, what's the deal with that? Like, how do we think about not only like the nomenclature of how we organize ourselves internally? You said you were in charge of the SDR team. So like, how do you organize yourselves around that motion? And then how are you and presumably your revenue leader thinking about division of responsibility, shared ownership of goals? What's the target? Especially since you're not necessarily tracking MQLs anymore, you're just tracking probably sales pipeline. So like, how did you get there, I guess, is my question.
Yeah, so I mean, when we track it, all of our go-to-market leadership team is based on number of closed deals. And then we extrapolate from there, okay, of those deals that come in, how many are going to be purely sales generated versus how many are going to be marketing generated? And that includes our outbound SDRs. And then we actually, when we build our models and our annual goals, that's what we build towards. Then the specific goals that I take ownership and accountability for are, one, what are those marketing / outbound deals that are coming in? But then two, how can we move things throughout the entire pipeline in a more efficient manner? So even if it was a lead generated by sales, can we get that lead to conversion window down? So those are my like two specific goals. But the lines really are becoming blurry, right? Like, so our SDRs are doing a bunch of outbounding, but they're also doing a bunch of data collection and very unique to our business, but we reach out to a bunch of brick and mortar retailers and there's not a ton of data there. And so we literally like download lease information, run it through an AI tool to try to grab contacts, do contact lookups, and then pass that off to our marketing team to do a bunch of outbound retargeting, right? So that's our SDRs are pulling that information, but it's being fed into all of these different channels. And so it really starts with like, how do you collectively think about the universe? What is the data that you have to go out and reach those audiences? And then which team is best equipped to work on the first, second, third, fourth, fifth touch point, and so on.
Makes perfect sense. And so you said, like, in this case, you just count outbound as marketing. Is that normal?
So the reason we count marketing, the outbound as marketing, is because frankly, we manage it all the same P&L, right? So whether we're spending money on a trade show, whether we're spending money on more SDRs, whether we're spending money on LinkedIn, at the end of the day, I have a set budget and I can hire however many people, however many contractors I need, however many, deploy those dollars wherever, but I'm responsible for getting those leads. And especially when it relates to SDRs, so much of that work is being automated. There's new ways to scale. There's a ton of really cool AI tools out there. It's no longer just the like number of bodies and actually getting people in like lobbies of offices. That is a very old school approach. And so it all is just, comes down to a single budget and where do we want to deploy that capital to get those leads.
Fascinating. Next slide, or you want to stay here for a bit?
Yeah, let's go to the next slide. So I mentioned this a couple times, but I just want to like really, really emphasize that the data that you're using to discover your leads, but then the interaction of that data across the stack is what's so important to tying all of this together, but also really getting trust within the organization. So like two examples that I go back to here is trade shows everybody's back in Vegas. Like pandemic is long gone. Everybody wants to be back in Vegas. I don't personally, but like trade shows are back. It's a thing. And so, if we invite a bunch of people to a dinner, or if we see a bunch of people at a webinar, our either SDRs or sales reps need to be following up with that person the very next day. Or if our SDR reaches out to someone and we hand that lead over, our AE needs to know what that conversation was and continue that dialogue. And I think this is where it's the classic, a prospect or a customer doesn't see org lines or technology breakages within your company. They just say, hey, Kiki works at Upside. And you can break that trust and that legitimacy so quickly if you aren't coordinated or orchestrated here. And so this is where, for us, it's really been, here at Upside, it's HubSpot in our CRM. At Plot, it was Marketo in our CRM, but really making sure that whatever marketing automation tool and lead capture tool you have is directly integrated with your CRM, and that everybody is working off of the same data sets. We run a big ABX program here at Upside, so a ton of heavy marketing to our top 300 accounts. And if we're going to spend $20,000 on a lead, that AE better be following up with them the second somebody fills out a contact sales form, right? And so that's where, just these talking of systems is so important. We'll talk about automation here in a little bit. I actually think that a lot of it just needs to be manually scrutinized until you get to this scale where automation is a luxury with a lot of these, larger leads, but the data connection there is really, really important.
I love that you said that, by the way, because that's something I also agree with a lot. Sometimes people use automations as a band-aid to doing the hard work of sales, which is, frankly, every Friday, your revenue leader, your RevTech person, your RevTech team, and the sellers get in a room and look at lists and ask the question, are we hitting everybody we should be hitting? Who are we not following up with? Sure, how can we make it easier? How can we enable the sales team to be better at their jobs? But I think a really big disconnect I noticed that both at Ramp and at mParticle was when sales leaders are having their weekly scrums with sellers, and they're reviewing those account lists, and they're obviously asking the question of where's the deal at, where's in the finish line, what's the commit status, and the rev leader is not sitting there asking the question, okay, how can I make this way easier? It's like the most simple suggestions I can have for anybody in the room is if you're not in the weekly sales conversations, you should totally get in the weekly sales conversations, because you'll find the 3 things that will make everybody's lives easier and make you a hero in those conversations,
100%. And also, so I'm a huge fan of that. I mean, I'm in every weekly sales conversation, and it's also just a great way to get feedback on the market in general. Also, this sounds silly, but don't just take for granted that, of course, an AE is following up with a lead because you flipped it to them, right? You really, and any good growth marketer who is, measuring a tight LTV to CAC for their spend is going to want to make sure that that lead is being followed up on. And it's again, I think automation is a good problem and pain to fall into. If you get to the point where your growth marketing leaders or event leaders are literally dealing with thousands of high quality leads every week, yes, you need to automate, but that needs to be a good problem that you fall into.
We had a really good question from Marco real quick, if we want to take a break. It says the choice of words, outbound versus nurture, or outbound nurture versus outbound prospecting, for example, versus outbound sales, is the reason why you chose nurture? Because you don't expect the outbound touch to generate a meeting or a sale, or is there some other reason why?
So, I guess to answer your question with a long way, but the framework that we've fallen back on, the type of company I really like working at in the last 4 have been is where there's a really strong core product market fit, and you want to expand your product set, or you want to expand your ICP. Maybe it means going from product-led growth to enterprise or new verticals. And the reality is that, especially when you're thinking about outbounding, it is highly variable to each one of those. And so when we're actually doing our modeling and our strategy, we're looking at inbound versus outbound, and then segmented by every single vertical. So you can almost think of it as a giant matrix. So outbounding for your SMB or PLG motion is going to be a lot more transactional, outbounding prospecting, quick ROI, and just a completely different sales cycle. Whereas you move more and more enterprise, and it typically becomes a much longer sales cycle. And it's important to know, if your lead to conversion is going to take 9 months, that outbounding approach is going to be significantly longer and more dynamic. And that's where I would refer to the term as nurture. And so I always, like, as you're starting to get to the sophistication of a multi-product company, really going back to that matrix of inbound, outbound, and then segmented by either vertical or company size, however your company does it, because every single box in that matrix is going to be slightly different with the strategy, data, and tools that you're using to actually go after those leads.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. Thank you. So it depends on the sales cycle for the specific customer that you're targeting.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah, that's clear. Thank you.
Great. So Kiki, we got a little bit of time left here. I guess the question is, do you want to cover anything else here, or should I quickly run through last couple slides and then we can open up for questions? What do you feel like?
Let's run through your slides so that we have more time for questions.
Okay, cool. Guys, I'm really not going to go through these. I was just going to say I'll leave these with you guys for a takeaway after the course. We basically wanted to address, okay, like talking to everybody is okay. As you grow, you need to qualify the route leads. Like, how do we actually do that? This provides a pretty nice framework for you to use if you've never set up lead scoring and lead routing. The only thing I would just maybe come back to is, and maybe we can have a conversation about as like a question, Kiki, is just like, what is the state of the world today on lead and contact enrichment? The reason I think this is a good topic is because this is really the core of lead scoring and lead routing. You know, if you guys back up a couple years, how was lead scoring and lead routing done? Well, you get a bunch of data either from questions that you ask or from enrichment providers like Clearbit, and then you make a decision. Are they qualified or not? And it's a programmatic decision. If then condition statement. If they are at a company where the size equals X and GLA equals Y and domain equals Z, route to qualified. If not, route to self-serve or dump them in some type of nurture campaign. So there's different sizes and stages of this evolution. You can be really sophisticated with lots of conditionals and routing statements, but at its core, that's literally what it is. And there are products out there in the market now like Default that just do this out of box for you. You plug in an SDK to your site, you design a landing page, and they will kind of figure out the routing for you and give you a cow link and all that stuff. And so we've now gotten to this point though, where, you know, there's not just one enrichment provider. There are many. There's ZoomInfo. You saw them on our slide deck. There's obviously Clearbit, but if Clearbit's been acquired by Apollo, we were acquired by HubSpot. There's obviously Apollo, who is both a sales tool and enrichment provider. So I kind of want to ask the question, Yukiki, like if you were starting from scratch again today, where would you invest your time and money on enrichment services? Would you build a waterfall, which I think is what a lot of people try to do inside their CRM? And I guess another question would be like, do you do anything about the fact that all these tools are enriching across the stack? Or is that not a problem you solve? Because I remember at Ramp, for example, we enriched in like 7 or 8 different spots across the stack, and it cost us a fortune. And at some point, it was just like, is this a $500,000 problem that we're just like not going to solve? And I don't know if that's the right answer or not.
Yeah. So first off, I've never found a single data enrichment company to be the end all and be all. It's always what's the accuracy, what's the scale, and then what is the uptime? Because if you start to have outages or gaps and leads are coming in and not getting scored, it just becomes like a friggin' nightmare. So I am always a fan of constantly testing, validating these vendors, but then also having dynamic partners coming in. The way that we've done it in the past is Clearbit, ZoomInfo, sort of your standard players, Mad Kudu's in there, and then a lot of your tools that you already have, like if you're doing AVX and you have 6sense, they already have a bunch of data. So pull those in as like a flat baseline. And there's a lot of like scoring methodologies, and then you can figure out like what is the threshold of an account must be over X, Y, and Z, and you can move that threshold up and down depending on the sort of volume of leads that you need to come in if you're willing to forego accuracy. But then on top of that, this is where this notion of like connective tissue comes into play. There's a lot of very, very niche data providers out there that are very relevant, especially as you are tapping into new verticals. So for example, at Upside, we have recently started to go after franchisees. We've never, ever worked with franchisees in the past, and there is a whole data ecosystem on just like franchisee data. And so now we've started to pull that in, and that, you know, data that can be scored by that provider actually trumps other providers that are coming in, right? And so it's all just going back to like, there's a bunch of really standard data providers in there that exist out there with very clear lead scoring stuff. Get that in as a baseline, and then pull in whatever might be unique to your business or your vertical that can help you get a competitive edge. Franchise arrangement, we are using Brizzo right now.
Mm.
And I've been pretty pleased with them.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I feel like it's just my observation. You know, back in 2016, enrichment was still very novel, and it was like, oh, there's only a couple of providers who are doing this. Obviously, you know, ZoomInfo and the merger with Discovery.org was like a big deal, but now it just feels like, again, data enrichment is kind of commoditized. It seems like every day there's a new data enrichment provider coming up. I also think that like there's an opportunity to enrich new types of data that was never possible with AI. So I have my head to the ground, particularly for vendors that are providing like unstructured data. Like, let's just scrape the web and find interesting things about people and companies that would not normally fit into a structured data format. And then, you know, I've also learned recently that a lot of these data providers actually rely on third-party vendors underneath the hood, like People Data Labs, which will provide, you know, a kind of an out-of-box solution for 5 different quote-unquote enrichment providers. You know, so they're basically just white labeling the solution and adding a premium on top. I recently ran a test with People Data Labs and one of these new vendors whose name I won't mention, and it was like the match was 100%. So it's clear, like, okay, we're just going to pay a premium on top for a new data set that's basically a new company, and like maybe they're doing something magical after they get this data, but not really, you know.
And I would just add that, like, to your point, it's very commoditized. It's a very crowded space. The incumbents are incredibly worried about these, you know, 1, 2, 3-person startups with very, very niche data, and everybody is petrified that AI is going to take over the space. And so, like every single data provider out there should be giving you a free test. Do not allow them to say otherwise at all, because they're scared shitless, for excuse my language, but like they truly are. And so just test around with it, play with it. You know, we're constantly you know, trying new folks and seeing what the coverage is and letting go of existing ones.
Also, a pro move for any of our small company providers, small company players, is that you can basically get free data for a pretty long time by doing tests with these guys. You can ask for 100, 200,000 records to cut QA. And even if you decide not to use the vendor, you can just import all the data. So one of the things we did in the beginning is we would, you know, we have a lead list of 10,000, 20,000 people we need enriched. We'll be like, great, go enrich these people and we'll see if it matches our database. And it's like, well, you know, now we have free enrichment. So it gives you an extra couple $100 every time you need to run a list, as opposed to doing it manually with Clay, where you got to pay like $1,000 for it, you know? Okay, we got some time left. Shai, you have your hand raised. Do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, it's probably a pretty stupid question, but just starting with, like, you know, HubSpot obviously acquired Clearbit. They're going to be building that into their like Breeze product. Just thinking about enrichment as being onboard CRM, which feels like maybe the wrong place from an upstream downstream perspective versus like offboard with solutions like Apollo and Clay. Can you just comment a little bit on that? Like, when would you use the built-in thing, maybe sacrifice the waterfall versus building it outside of the CRM?
Yeah, I mean, I'll put on my clarify hat for here for a second and just say that I think waterfall enrichment should live inside the CRM. It's obviously very biased, and I have a personal interest in making that dream come true. But you know, we do that natively. We have 3 enrichment providers that we're running in the background. There's this, I guess, like agitation happening in the market of like exactly your point. Should this live off-prem or on-prem? The issue is that right now people enrich in like 5 or 6 different spots and also the warehouse. And so it's like a lot of work to manage a waterfall yourself, and then to also ensure that you're not over enriching across the stack and you end up paying for it. Again, that was the case I alluded to at Ramp, where it's like we were on the unlimited plan with a bunch of these providers because we just couldn't get our shit together. We didn't actually know how much we're enriching. We were only actually getting 3,000 leads a day at one point, or maybe 5,000 leads a day. So it shouldn't have been more than 150, 200,000 credits a month. But we were on the unlimited plan because we just couldn't control the fact that these 3,000 leads were getting enriched like 6 different times in the day. So that's where I feel like, there's a real case to be made for the all-in-one enrichment. And for what it's worth, I kind of see this happening among like some providers out there, like Default, Unify, Folk, Adio, obviously Clarify. Like a lot of us are thinking about this, especially because Clearbit is going away. I mean, they've jacked up their prices for outside vendors. It costs us 5 cents to enrich with Clearbit compared to 2 cents, even like a fractional cent with Apollo and others. And so, yeah, I mean, I think if I were in your shoes, I'd be thinking about, like this should live inside the CRM. Does that reality happen tomorrow? Probably not. So in the meantime, maybe build it yourself. If you're a HubSpot customer, it's obviously very convenient though to just like click a button and not have to worry about enrichment. But there is this big question in my mind of like, how well are they going to be able to maintain that data quality now that it's become part of a bigger company?
Thanks.
The test I'd set up with you, Shai, if I were in your shoes, because I'm pretty sure a HubSpot user is like, is there some way to measure the percent enrichment of all your contacts and be measuring that over time? And like at some point in the next 6 to 12 months, if you're like, oh man, enrichment percent is below 40, that's probably when you start to make a decision or something like that.
Yeah, well, and just kind of going back to the franchise question, it's like we are going after SMBs and franchises, and a lot of these kind of built-in ones are really decent for enterprise, but not so much for like the industry specific stuff, to Michael's point.
We got time left for one more question. And I realize we always say that we'll have more time for questions. The good news is that Monday next week is all questions. So if there's one more question people have, feel free to raise your hand or just jump in.
If no one else has questions, I have one, but I asked one already. So if somebody else wants to ask.
I don't see any hands, so go for it, Marco.
Okay. It may be a question that takes a long time to answer, but we can answer it quickly. I was thinking about pros and cons of minimizing tools versus maximizing capabilities. So assuming you're a company in a scale stage, so you have all the resources in the world, and you're looking to just, make the most intelligent choices, how do you think about moving inside of this spectrum? So on one hand, for example, you can have a super simple stack with HubSpot and a few other tools. HubSpot is an all-in-one tool. It does many things pretty well. It doesn't do all the things in an excellent way. And you can go to the other end of the spectrum where you integrate a bunch of tools that are excellent at what they do, but then you have to manage the integrations. So again, I know that it takes a long time to answer, but at high level, how do you think about this? How do you move inside of this spectrum?
Kiki, what do you think? This is a great question.
It is a great question. Like what comes to mind for me is, like the jar to fit the most balls in. You put the big ones and the medium-sized ones, then the small ones. I think it's kind of like the same approach. If you really need to have like marketing automation, your CRM, like what are the big ones that you're really going to anchor around? And then you can constantly be testing and filling in around it. I mean, I'll say for what it's worth now, like the actual list of tools and vendors has changed, but when I ran marketing for a billion-dollar company, a $500 million company, a $200 million company, and an $80 million company, every single time we had a vendor list of about 25 to 30. Now, who those vendors are obviously changed, but that was like as many as we could realistically manage and keep track of.
Yeah. Well, I love what you're saying here because it's kind of like there's basically no silver bullet, which I know feels probably like a disappointing outcome of this class because I always encounter this as people want answers to all of life's problems, but the answer is like it's very much a function of the context you work in. What I would say, Marco, though, is like if I were trying to pick a framework, I think the framework would be like, what are the constraints to you and your business? If a constraint is engineering resources, then that's the reason why people go with all-in-one. It's because it's hard. You don't have the resources and tools to set up and manage these things, then don't. I think people get in trouble where they maybe bite off more they can chew by trying to pursue a best-in-class stack approach like you suggested, but all of a sudden they realize that it's just them managing the tool set and trying to do the work, and it becomes overwhelming. That's exactly what happened with one of our friends at Athena, by the way. It's like the founder over there, Mike, he had an awesome guy that he brought in, set up this really cool stack that had tons of tools, but then this kid left to go create his own company, and he was left with like 15 different tools doing a bespoke thing for every single purpose. And he didn't have the time to manage it as a founder. So he was just decommissioning tools for a whole month. And I think that's like a big emphasis here is like, what do you reasonably have the ability to do? And I also think this requires us to be somewhat selfless in our service acts towards our organizations. Like, it's not only what can you do, but like what will the organization actually be able to solve when you're gone, right? Like sometimes I think people come in with high ambitions to like leave their mark, but they leave a mark of pain because they do stuff that only they can manage afterwards. So I think thinking critically about what is our organization actually able to handle even without me is a really good artifact. And then the last thing I would say is, there's no problem with these things happening over time, right? I think the reason why a lot of people evolve is because they buy all-in-one solutions and they realize afterwards that the bespoke thing that you're doing in HubSpot is not good enough. And so if it becomes a big enough pain, you go solve it with a better tool. That's, I think, honestly, one of the reasons why a lot of people use HubSpot as a starting point to CRM and all of marketing is because, like you said, it does 60, 70, 80% of the things you need to do, even if it's not excellent, as that excellence becomes a needs, you can kind of change it out for a new tool. We had it happen with like a video webinar tool in Ramp. The last thing I would say though is, so regardless of what you do, being careful about coupling as you make these decisions is probably like the one takeaway, right? Like thoughtfulness around how you connect this tool to HubSpot or to Salesforce or to your CDP. That would be my only word of caution if you pursue the route of, hey, we're going to be a best-in-class tool provider. So summarizing for you, it's like, yeah, context matters, situation matters, resources matter, complexity matters, what your organization can handle matters, and then also what type of stack are you going to create out of it?
Yeah, I think I was looking for from frameworks, so the two answers both help.
Cool. Well, guys, thank you so much for another wonderful class. We got one more class next Monday. Get your questions in. There's more material for you guys to look at on Maven. And then I think some of you guys should have been getting surveys from Maven too. I read every single one of them and I look for your guys' feedback. So my only ask would be, if when you give the rating, there's a spot that has the ability for you to share feedback. And I'd love to hear on things that you think are going really well and things that you maybe would hope that would be changed or would be better. There's still some time for me to cover the things that we could change in Monday's session. And then it also is just encouraging for me to hear the things that are going well, because if I don't hear from you, then I don't really know what's sticking or not. So that would be the framework I'd leave with you guys for Monday. If you get the survey, fill it out. I have thick skin. You can tell me I suck. I don't care. I do care because I'll improve, but I won't cry about it. And think about 3 things to maintain and 3 things to improve. That would be my only ask. Otherwise, thank you for an amazing session. Kiki, thank you so much for coming by. I really appreciate it.
For having me. Great to meet you all.
Bye, y'all. See you on Monday.
Bye, everyone.